Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kat Plimpton. I'm the Outreach and Operations Director with the Northwest Energy Coalition, and I use she, her pronouns. I am joining this event from Seattle. I would like to begin today by acknowledging that I am on the traditional land of the Coast Salish tribes, specifically the Duwamish, Suquamish, Stillaguamish, and Muckleshoot peoples, past and present, and I honor with gratitude the land itself and these tribal communities. I hope you will do the same from wherever you are today. The Northwest Energy Coalition, please go ahead and use the chat box to share your name, organization, pronouns, and acknowledgement of the tribal land you are on. The Northwest Energy Coalition is an alliance of over 100 member organizations. We advance clean, equitable, and affordable energy policies by leveraging our analytic expertise and convening a broad alliance of people and organizations. Thank you to our sponsor, Idaho Power Company, for supporting today's Lunch and Learn on utility planning. The coalition strives to create a safe space for people of all races, ethnicities, sexual orientations, genders, and abilities. A key part of this is ensuring that participants of virtual events like this one engage respectfully with one another and with our panelists. You can turn on closed captioning by clicking on the CC Live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We encourage you to engage in the chat on the topics speakers are discussing during this panel. Please ensure your messages are on topic and respectful of the panelists and other participants. Disrespectful comments will be grounds for removal from this learning session. We are putting a link in the chat to our pamphlet for this session, which includes the speaker bios and a survey we'd like you to fill out at the end of the session. You can also donate to the coalition in support of our work and these learning sessions. With that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Jeff Bissonette, our moderator for today's session.
Thanks, Kat. It's a pleasure to be here and have everyone join us for what I think is going to be a fascinating conversation. Distribution system planning is critical for the planning and development of the electric grid. It's a way to forecast and maintain the electric system's reliability and efficiency while providing affordable services to customers. Customer-side resources can enable utilities to optimize their system, manage electricity demand, and reduce the need for additional utility-scale generation, leading to a cleaner, more efficient, resilient, and affordable energy system. Fully deploying these resources, including energy efficiency, storage, distributed generation, flexible demand, highlights the importance of distribution system planning, something that has traditionally been done without stakeholder input. Today, we're pleased to have Samir Sukar with ICF, Brad Williams with Oracle, and he is also going to be supported by David Siddiqui in the audience, and Angela Long with Portland General Electric. Their full bios are in the pamphlet that there's a link to in the Zoom chat. They will each give opening remarks, and after each one, we'll take a few questions from the audience. Then I have some questions for our panel, and in between those questions, we'll have additional time for audience members to ask questions. So let's get going. First, Samir Sukar from ICF. You want to give your kind of opening remarks?
Perfect. Sure. Thanks so much, Jeff and Kat, and thanks to the coalition the opportunity to offer some thoughts on this issue that's near and dear to my heart. I'll share a few slides here. Hopefully you can see that. So ICF is a large firm that works in a lot of areas, including 1,000+ folks in the energy side. We're on the distribution side of things, and I've done quite a bit of work on distribution system planning across the country and in the West, and including a recent effort as part of our work supporting Department of Energy engaging with states in the NARUC-NASIO Task Force on Comprehensive Electricity Planning.
And Samir,
particularly relevant.
Sorry, we aren't seeing your slides quite yet.
Oh, got it. Yep. Forgot one key step here. That should do it.
Yep, great.
All right. You didn't miss anything. So let me start here. What's changing, right? So you can think about sort of, utility infrastructure in terms of facilitating power flow, information flow, transaction flows. In a way, nothing is changing. In a way, everything is changing. The power flows kind of from generation to consumption, but now generation is everywhere. Information flows, you can think about them from generation sources to system operators and customers, but now sort of the nature of that information, sort of the information flows and sort of the information that's needed, the granularity of that information is changing quite a bit. And also transaction flows in terms of sort of thinking about services and markets, but now sort of the types of markets, the access to those markets and sort of the market designs themselves are changing rapidly. So is nothing changing? Is everything changing? Of course, the answer is yes. So to get into this a little bit and see sort of what the implication is for having the proliferation of these distributed resources and in terms of how we plan the system, typically think about planning in terms of kind of a single deterministic forecast, some engineering analysis that then leads to investment roadmap. And once you get into really making distributed resources kind of an integral part of that, then you start to think about different kinds of analysis around hosting capacity or thinking about DER valuation, thinking about DER sourcing mechanisms, et cetera. And also looking at how the distribution system interfaces with resources and transmission, sort of thinking about how those planning efforts sort of couple together. And sort of generally speaking, this is kind of a reflection of the fact that if you look at sort of different sort of planning processes, you can think about sort of asset management, distribution planning, resource planning, transmission planning, but focusing on distribution planning and resource planning in particular, you're looking at kind of load serving capacity, distribution system reliability in the case of distribution planning, and then for resource planning, maybe supply demand balance and resource adequacy. Importantly, as you think about sort of the evolution of planning, now we're adding some elements off to the right in terms of kind of how you support the integration, utilization of those resources, how you think about sort of the impact of distributed resources and resource adequacy. And that in itself is kind of, just a small picture of kind of this overall evolution going from sort of traditional planning requirements, think about reliability, safety, security, resource adequacy, to maybe thinking about how you plan towards resilience and wildfire risk mitigation, decarbonization, energy storage, system flexibility, et cetera, to now thinking about how you put in place sort of the infrastructure that supports equity and environmental justice, electrification, transmission, distribution, generation, sort of co-optimization, et cetera. And so it's kind of this view of kind of what we're planning toward, sort of what the objectives are expanding. We need to think about sort of, what are the planning processes that support that? And that's what, was sort of foundational to what NARUC and NASIO did, brought together 15 states and territories and started to think about what are sort of possible visions for that kind of planning. And they came up with 5 visions. Those are kind of the circular diagrams. You can think of them as sort of circular timelines going from sort of 12 noon and sort of proceeding around sort of clockwise. And I'll explain a little bit more in a second. But those look very different. I mean, if you look at sort of where does state policy intersect, it came in different places. If you look at sort of, what's the role of the state regulatory commission, very different sort of roles and places where they sort of intersect into the planning process. And if you look at stakeholder engagement, sort of identify different parts of the planning process, different ways in which sort of stakeholders can engage in the planning process. So in a way, these represent very different visions for planning. You know, the states and territories involved were divided into these 5 cohorts that are sort of, you know, designated by color. So at first blush, you look at sort of the arrangement of these pieces and sort of, you know, how they think about planning. It looks very different. And just to say another word about what these are, because it looks a little bit strange. You can think of them, like I said, like sort of circular timelines, but they're concentric rings. So the inner ring in this case is distribution planning, and then resource planning is the next ring. Transmission planning is the next ring, and RTO transmission planning is the last ring. And like I said, you kind of start at the top and proceed around clockwise. So these are kind of 3 different circular timelines. They look very different, but if you take a close look, in particular, kind of the light blue, which is the solution identification, you start to see some themes. So this cohort said kind of about this step on sort of combined set of solution options. It represents the idea of assembling a complete set of potential solution options for review in a holistic manner for meeting the needs identified in each of the planning processes. So it's really sort of a combined process that sort of cuts across all 3. The turquoise cohort said solutions in one process may be used to address an identified need in a separate process. So this gets to something Jeff just mentioned, right? So it says distributed generation may reduce the need for utility scale generation resources and transmission, or greater transmission may reduce the need for local generation resources, right? So looking at sort of those trade-offs. And then the silver cohort did something interesting where they identified in the inner ring, that's the distribution planning, kind of the development of a distributed energy resource supply curve. And the idea is that you sort of take that supply curve and combine it with traditional kind of supply side central station supply options and provide sort of a composite supply curves that reflects all of the supply side and demand side resources that can meet system needs. So again, we're starting to see some sort of commonalities across these visions that again gets to sort of supporting the need for change and supporting you know, the kind of infrastructure that can enable progress toward meeting some these expanded set of goals. So in conclusion, again, nothing is changing, everything is changing. We're asking more from the power grid, and getting to the right answers means connecting the dots in the right way and engaging stakeholders effectively. So I will leave it there. And Jeff, back to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Samir. That was really interesting. Are there any questions from the audience for Samir, just to clarify some stuff before we move on? Not seeing anything in the chat. Nancy asked a question: did the cohorts see barriers to bringing in distribution system planning, or DSP?
Absolutely. So I had a URL in there, neroot.org/taskforce, and you'll see some interesting resources. One of those is a blueprint for state action, and in the back identifies a number of different challenges. It could be related to access to information. It could be related to the capability of models. It could be related to ability to get effective stakeholder engagement. It could be related to any number of sort of either institutional or technical or analytical barriers. And as part of that roadmap for state action identifies possible solutions for each of those barriers. So that's a great resource. I recommend folks take a look, and thanks, Nancy, for the question.
Other questions for Samir? Not seeing any. So why don't we go ahead and move on to Brett Williams.
Are you able to see my screen okay?
Yep, we can see you.
Okay, excellent. So I want to share our Oracle perspective and the customers that we are working with in order to share how our customers are getting the most value out of supply side resources and distribution system planning from our perspective. I'm joined by my colleague, David Siddiqui, who's going to help me out as we go, but I'm just going to jump right into it here if we can. So I want to talk about the whole life cycle of distributed energy resources. And in this case, it could be electric vehicles, it could be rooftop solar, it could be smart thermostat, demand response. But it starts with the customer purchases, the end user is purchasing something. So in this case, electric vehicle. They go bring home electric vehicle and put in type 2 charger and may or may not let their utility know that they have done that. But the good thing is with smart metering analytics, we can be able to disaggregate different components of load that is measured and identify electric vehicle adoption in this case, or it could be rooftop solar, it could be other types of distributed energy resources that we can identify. Certainly, if there is any injecting resources, PV, solar, anything that injects into the network, that would require a connection process, which would be the entry point of that information of what's being connected. And that's a key part, is like we need to actually understand what we're connecting to in order to provide that safe, reliable service that customers expect. And so that's the initial part, is connecting and knowing what that is. We create a digital twin model of that device, and that gives us the ability to simulate what the impacts are. But the other aspect of that is based on the type of device. The utility can offer specific programs and targeted programs for that specific type of device in order to get the value not only for the customer, but also the value that it brings as a grid side resource as well as a supply side resource. Then once a customer chooses a specific program, they want a smart charging rate program, for example, which may defer charging during peak hours to off-peak hours, or provide incentives to do that. There's ways we can measure that and validate that. And then we can create some analysis of what is its impact on the grid by doing some forecasting and network analysis. And this is some of the planning functions that we may be used to. And now we're moving this into more of an operational perspective as well, to provide localized network management, particularly capacity management, as well as voltage, VAR support, constraint management. And that's where these devices can be dispatched to respond to events, not only for supply side, but also for grid side events, such as voltage. And that's why we need to be able to have a good model of what is these devices capable of, and what program allows the utility to communicate and control a device. And maybe it's through an aggregator, but that all has to be taken into account. And then the ongoing reporting and constant continued engagement of what the customer is involved in, and how did they perform, and what other things can we offer to these customers to further support them going forward. And then that would start the whole cycle all over again as they enroll in additional programs, or perhaps bring in additional devices to be participating in that. So the issue is, this is a lot of systems, and we realize that. So if we look at what is a distributed energy resource management system, we tend to think of it from a planning operations tool, and that's the one we focus on a lot, but it also is a market operations. And what we're going to talk about the need for market operations. Customer and programs management absolutely has to be part of a DER management program. And that's the only way these other things actually work, is that if they have effective program management that goes with that. Analytics to understand the characteristics, create that digital twin model, be able to forecast, provide some state estimation, ongoing measurement, verification, and analysis and performance. Device management is another key factor that I think doesn't get a lot of recognition today, but we really do need to understand what we are connecting to and what are the both the physical attributes, the electrical characteristics of that device, but also the programs. What programs are allowed to engage these devices for grid side as well as supply side resources. And then there's a field service component, let's say, for installing devices, inspecting, ongoing support, a loss of service calls. I need support, so we need to be able to support that. Then we look at the systems that are involved from a planning and operational perspective, and we have an application called Network Management System, which is a real-time model of the distribution network as well as transmission, but also the customer and any beyond the meter customer resources are part of this model. And that's an important factor to distinguish in order to provide planning and ongoing operational support. Have to be able to model the customer resources. And so we have ways to create the models and then provide connections for real-time control, either through aggregators or directly through to the devices, both utility scale and as well as customer scale. And then we can optimize that for performance to respond to grid constraints, market requirements, and so forth are all part of that optimization engine. How that looks is these icons on the network actually are the digital twin models of the actual devices. So in this case, it's a utility scale storage plant, or it could be a charging EV charging station that may be participating in demand response, or individual distribution transformers that the secondaries and services can aggregate the individual customers and their connections. So they give full visibility for the planning and operations engineering functions, as well as the real-time operations. And with that, you can perform some simulations of peak loads, minimum loads, peak outputs of devices, and then be able to mitigate constraints that are forecasted throughout a planning period or an operational period, like a 24-hour look ahead from an operational perspective, a planning or new connect process over the course of a year, and give full visibility of devices that are causing some issues that need some additional attention, or if they're participating in an existing program in real time, to be able to see that this in this case, this charging station has a demand response event, and they're deferring state of charge, rate of charge, and during the peak hours. And then from a scheduling perspective, can provide the day ahead, look ahead from a scheduling, and use that for ongoing day ahead planning as well as operational planning. Analytics is also a key part to be able to support these disaggregated models as well as engaging customers. And then I want to kind of leave with another key component of being able to understand devices and where we need operational device management for DER devices. And I already mentioned physical characteristic, electrical characteristic, but also contractual and behavioral characteristics need to be factored into that. What programs are they under, and what performance, past performance, if we call upon this, what can we really expect from a given device? So we need to understand that from a grid application perspective is the expected performance. I'll just leave it with that, and I appreciate the opportunity to share our experience. Thank you.
Thanks, Brad. And we'll also bring David Siddiqui in here as your Lifeline Phone a Friend function. And I know that there was a question from Fred. And Fred, why don't you go ahead and ask your question, and then Martin has one right behind you.
Everybody, so it was a great presentations. I want to ask maybe a broader question, and maybe Angela wants to answer this one too, but I'll ask it anyway. That there's been a lot of concern or accusations that demand response doesn't, quote unquote, show up when it's needed. This came out of what happened in California last year and Texas earlier this year. A lot of that, the existing demand response there is actually large commercial and industrial. And what they and their aggregators say is, hey, wait a minute, the program designs and the market rules for these are not really very good for us. Now, as we're seeing a lot more of an effort to get residential and small commercial customers going, there's a lot of uncertainty about how much of that we can count on. If you want 50 megawatts in the next hour, of DR, can you really get it? Could you talk a little bit about that and how much confidence we should have in the ability to deliver these resources when they're needed?
Yeah, I'll start that. And so it's very important to understand, one, what is the device actually capable of when it's being called upon, because it may not be available for the entire period. And so that's part of the reason to have that digital twin modeling. The other is performance and expected performance, because that's my experience as a planning engineer. Is demand response is typically okay, works pretty good the first day it's called upon, but if it's the third hottest day of consecutively calling upon it, the hottest day of the year, then participation rate drops significantly. And so that needs to be actually factored in as part of the modeling of when it's called upon. How much do we actually need to call upon in order to get the expected results we're looking for? And I know, like when demand response is called upon for generation supply requirements, they typically call much more than what is needed because of probability says it's not everybody's going to participate at the same rates. And so that's why the analytics is so important to this, is that we have some history and track record, as well as the program requirements, that there may be penalties if they choose not to participate after they've agreed to a program that they're part of. So having that continuous customer engagement is what we're finding is really helps, particularly in some of the O-Power programs that we have found to be successful, is how we can provide ongoing customer engagement to show them how well they have performed and what they can do to continue to improve in these areas.
Yeah, and I would just add real quickly from the O-Power perspective with like behavioral demand response programs as an example. We've been delivering these, for many years now. And I think, the more that we deliver and the more places we deliver these in, you can actually forecast and model the expected, capacity resource relatively well, right? And, I think if you were to deploy all of our, BDR programs, for example, at the same time right now, where it's something like 450, megawatts or so a sized capacity resource. And, I think as we continue, calling more and more events and working with more and more customers and having more and more data come into the system, we're able to, essentially forecast that pretty well.
Great, thanks. Martin, we'll let you ask your question, and then we'll move on to Angela.
Okay, and my question, I think, was covered partly by the last question, actually, but I'll adjust it a little bit. The common concern continuing to be expressed by utilities is the complexity created by added home solar, for instance, added community solar, maybe additional loads urged by decarbonization. Are these modeling techniques going to be able to keep up with that so that isn't a concern and isn't an objection from utilities on community solar, for instance, and just the proliferation that we're frankly trying to get to with more of the distributed clean energy generation? That's the question.
Yeah, so let me start. So if I understand the question correctly, is we like for example, when demand response events are called upon, there is a snapback function that when the event is over, that all the air conditioning turns on and the load actually increases afterwards, and that is part of the analysis that goes into this. Is when a demand response event is called, we actually factor in what will the device produce, but is there any pre-cooling functions or preheating functions that come prior to the actual event that we need to factor in, as well as the post-event snapback function of load. And that is part of our analysis. I think our experience, like with rooftop solar, is being able to disaggregate what is load and what is a DER becomes very important. So we can forecast and have real-time weather feeds into our digital twin models to say, okay, it's a partly cloudy day. The solar output at this location at this time is going to drop. What is the impact of that? And that is part of our analysis, is that we can, even though these things are not measured in real time, that digital twin model with some weather feeds can actually give us some very good insight of what is happening at a specific location, and we can use that as part of the modeling function. David, I don't know if you had any other thoughts to add. Yeah. Is that what you were looking for, Martin? Yeah.
Well, yeah. And so it sounds like that scenario, it will enable us to effectively integrate the rooftop solar home, especially, the very small distributed ones is what I was thinking of, even community solar. And then the other side of it is the urgency to decarbonize, therefore electrify more components of a home, for instance, getting away, heat pumps, cooktops and such like that could have, for a home, kind of a big draw on the electricity compared to gas, using gas for that.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, what I hear a lot in committee hearings is the utilities saying, this distribution is a big puzzle, and it sounds like these modeling can help solve that puzzle. So there won't be as many objections to trying to get more home solar out and all the other changes that's going to occur in the next 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Between the solar and like electric vehicle adoption, it's like there's a real opportunity to engage customers to understand the impacts and how they can actually be a part of the solution instead of causing the problem by participating in programs that can help shape the demand, because the capacity is available if you can have some flexibility of when that's used. And so I think that's, or when a community may need some additional resources that could be solved by putting in a battery in that community, or getting programs to get customers to add batteries to their homes, those types of things. So
okay,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And Melissa, you had a question about equity, and we'll get into that later, but I think it's a good place to inject that. So would you like to ask your question, Melissa Martin?
Sorry, I was trying to get myself off mute there.
Sorry.
And for sure, if this needs to be pushed to later,
No, go ahead.
I'm just curious how equity plays into the conversation of DR. More in, it's, to me, from the sounds of it, those with larger loads are really getting the benefit by being able to shift their use, and those that already have a low use maybe aren't ever going to see a benefit from demand response programs. And then similar to how when new technology is brought on, usually it's the wealthy that are able to afford it, and usually that's where the incentives are. So I'm just curious if that's been more in the conversation, especially with policies having a lot more focus on how the energy system will be more equitable.
So yeah, a couple things there. One is from the planning perspective, I think cost actually needs to be a key part of this. Is every time you are adding infrastructure to connect a rooftop solar or more EV charging and things like that, if that is increasing costs for non-participants, then that needs to be factored in. It's like, but if we are leveraging customers to participate in order to make it lower cost for everybody, that would be an objective, a planning objective. Instead of putting in new infrastructure that everybody's going to have to pay for, can we do this with a non-wires alternative that, yes, it will benefit the participants, but it benefits everybody from a reliability perspective and cost perspective if you're not having to build out infrastructure that everybody has to pay for, that even if they're not participating. So I guess that's my view. It's like that should be factored in as part of the planning process of what is the impact of non-participants and how do you encourage even the less affluent people to have some way to participate in these things.
And again, I would add too, I think there's an interesting point there, or distinction worth noting, that it's not necessarily the case that low-income customers have lower usage than non-low-income customers. So I think that's an important thing to not assume there. But yeah, I mean, definitely agree that equity needs to be sort of a foundational aspect to all this stuff, and that's an area of focus of ours on the O-Power side quite a bit lately in terms of figuring out how to make sure that the process of actually participating, understanding what kinds of programs are available to you is as sort of streamlined and easy as possible, and really making sure that we have that equitable access. So definitely agree.
Great. Thank you very much. With that, let's go to Angela Long with Portland General Electric. Angela, welcome.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, is it okay if I touch on a couple of these questions before I jump in?
Absolutely.
To my presentation?
Yep.
The first, to Fred's question around demand response and whether it has value for us. And the one thing that I always think about is demand response, they're not all created equal, right? An irrigation load control program where a farmer has to go out and shut down a piece of equipment is a lot different than a fast acting resource like a smart thermostat. And so, one of the things when we think about resources and whether something has value for us is we really need to have a conversation about its attributes and its characteristics and whether it can actually perform the grid needs that we need it to perform. And the other thing I think that Brad or David touched on is really around tariff design. Are we allowed to operate those pieces of equipment when we need it? So we saw some very extreme weather this year here in Oregon. We had heat waves and wildfires and ice storms, and some of those fell on weekends. And our regulatory construct, which we have programs, they don't allow us to operate them on weekends. And so those are things that we need to go back and we need to fix our programs so they act just like the system acts. So they're available real time. And then we also have to make sure that we're building out programs that are big enough to solve the cases that we need to solve. So, someone mentioned earlier about having enough capacity to sustain a long period of time. So you might have to have more of those resources or procure more of those resources so you can have them over a longer period of time. But I would say here at PGE, we did call demand response during our heat waves, and we did get 62 megawatts of demand response at the time we needed it, and it was successful for us. And deploying that as a resource at that time. So we're going to continue to investigate it and figure out where their opportunities are there. And then Martin had mentioned solar, and I would say utilities are not fundamentally, like at least PG here at PG, we're not opposed to solar or community solar. I think that we are challenged with how the regulatory environment is for solar. So for instance, if a customer comes to install net metering and applies for net metering application and they want to install rooftop solar in their home, we cannot leverage that unit today. It only provides constraints to our system because the current code in Oregon is an outdated IEEE standard that doesn't require those units to have smart inverters. And so when someone connects to our system, even with a smart inverter, we have to dumb it down because we can't leverage that. And so we really need to have a conversation with our regulators on how do we make sure that these pieces of equipment can not just give value to a homeowner, but how can we leverage that equipment for the value of all of our customers? And that might be updating codes and standards. I would also say we've deployed what we call a 2-meter solution here in Oregon, where we're looking at helping customers come onto the grid easily without high interconnection costs. And we found through that pilot that when we have backfeed on the system, that sometimes that's coming from neighboring utilities. And even if we did reduce backfeed on the system for solar, we might get it from other places. And so we're just trying to manage all of that right now, but we see significant value in solar to be able to help us with clean energy goals in the future. And then equity, there was a question around equity. I think Melissa might have asked it. And I would say that I think the problem with that is that we have a broken construct on how we look at cost effectiveness. And we really do look at cost effectiveness from the standard protocol, which has a certain perspective and is answering a certain question, and it's not asking questions around how we help customers that are in vulnerable communities. How do we deal with resiliency or people who are on the end of the line? And one of the things I think we really need to have a conversation in this industry around is how do we get to a conversation about cost benefit analysis that looks at the different perspectives and questions we're trying to answer. And then we put the right prudency or cost recovery reviews in place to help all customers, and that we don't just have this blanket approach towards how we recover those dollars or how we show that those dollars are prudently spent. That's me getting on my high horse, and I'll end on that. And I will say that someone asked a question that reminded me of resource planning, which is what I would like to talk about today. So I'll share some slides there. So let me pull this up. Give me 1 second. Okay, so can you see my screen okay?
Yep, looks good.
So the question, first of all, it's really hard to come after Samir because he nailed it in terms of how the distribution system is operating and where it's changing. So I will try not to duplicate that because I think he nailed it. But I would say the way that I see distribution system planning changing is that it's really this marriage between generation and T&D planning to start thinking about resource planning and the integration of that into how we do planning, not just for the long term, but also for the short term, and starting to think about near-term impacts. And I think that this becomes even more critical as we start to address, climate change and severe weather, that we need to start planning for our system in real time. And we need our system not to just be planning for large loads for customers or dealing with the rule of thumb of, and I'm making this up, a 1% load growth, but we really need that distribution system plan or planning to incorporate where is it that we're trying to go? What are the things we're trying to solve for our customers? How do we help our customers integrate to our grid? How do we help them do that without substantial costs? And then how do we start thinking about a suite of solutions to be able to identify or to solve identified grid needs? And we really need to do that with our community. We can't plan for a system anymore without really putting customers at the center of what we're doing. And so I like to say that we're moving away from planning for a system to planning for humans, and making sure that everything we do is thinking about the people who are going to be using the product that we're offering, and making sure that that has value to them, and it's meeting them where they're at, regardless of what type of customer that is. And so that's going to require us to come up with new tools, new resources, look at DERs as a real asset on the system, start to really predict how resiliency or other potential future scenarios might integrate with our T&D planning and our forecasting. And so for me, I like to think about it as a phased maturity. Today, we're less coordinated. We're not as integrated. We do resource planning. We identify needs across a variety of different groups in an organization. So whether it's customer programs or it's interconnection or it's IRP or TND planning, everybody is identifying some suite of solution, and they're not necessarily coordinated or integrated. And we have our TND and generation planning processes that are siloed. And we really need to move in partnership with the people that we're serving to have more advanced granular forecasting, to be able to streamline our solutions and make them locational and have value for the customers we're serving, and making sure that they are optimized, our processes are optimized and continuous. You know, and I see distribution system planning having multiple elements, and you could argue that there's a lot here that I haven't included, but I would say today we really need to think about interconnection process and getting to a maturity where it's fully integrated, just like we do with any other of our resources, whether it's customer sided or utility. We need to start thinking about hosting capacity and what is the right granularity and frequency of updating that. So that way we know where you can install community solar, where can customers install rooftop solar without substantial upgrades, or where they can actually operationalize their equipment. And we need to do this with humans in mind. And we can't just build a system anymore where we're not thinking about the people that we're serving. And that starts with really maturing our perspective. And I would say that as being in the utility industry for a while now, we haven't had to have a lot of publicly available data, or we haven't had to put it in a way that's holistic for people to understand, or communicate it in a way that people can relate to. And that's going to be a big shift for us. And so one of the things that we're going to have to do is start to think about people and planning for them, but then also how we bring the communities along. And it's not just us talking to them, but it's a two-way flow of information where we're hearing what they need and then designing our system to meet their needs. And so for me, this really looks like, starting with some foundational capabilities. I think some utilities have far more maturity than others, but, we're going to have real, the foundations nailed down, and then move to advanced capabilities. So instead of taking a least cost, least risk review, start to look at the individual perspectives or use cases that we're going to be doing, and start to think about a best fit approach. And then we're really going to have to start thinking about our overarching capabilities and how we build in things like workforce strategies, cybersecurity, how regulatory compliance feeds into how we upgrade our system. And I really see this as a platform and a framework, which every piece is really critical in order for us to be able to achieve, a modernized grid or an integrated grid. And so I don't know, can you guys see this? Do you see this bar over? I can't tell if you can see it on your screen or not, but this light blue here, which is the customer ecosystem, I think that's that human-centered planning process and making sure that all of our systems work together for that. So those are my slides. And I'll kick it back over to you, Jeff.
Great, thank you. Nancy, you had a question?
And I wanted to know, how long you think that maturing process should take, in your slide where you went from phase 1 to phase 4. Is that 2 years? Is that 10 years or 20?
Well, I think it depends on what you're trying to solve. So my personal opinion and the work that I do, I think my North Star is how do I help combat climate change? And if you think of that, there's not a lot of time, and there is a lot of work that needs to be accelerated and done quickly. But realistically, this is going to involve changes in regulatory requirements. You're going to have to build partnerships with communities, and all of that takes time. And I would say realistically, we could probably spend the next 2 to 3 years getting to a place where we all agree on what that next step looks like. But in some of these, I think a lot of the investments too, they're 3 to 5 year. I mean, to go from planning to procurement to, installing and or operating some of these buildings, some of these things, it could take substantial amount of time. So it's going to be really important for us as an industry to make sure that we're saying that this is where we want to go by a certain date, and then we work together to make sure that we have common goals and outcomes to meet that. So Nancy, that's my way of saying it, like, I have a huge sense of urgency and there's no time.
Other questions for Angela before we kind of move into a more general discussion? Okay. So for our panels, we had some questions, and I'm actually going to look at the second question first, just because it connects just with what Angela, I think, was talking about. And that's not that long ago, utilities weren't as willing as they are today to engage in distribution level discussions with very many stakeholders. And I'm wondering what, brought about that change, and can you give examples from either within the Northwest region or outside the region of how distribution system planning is changing to include input from a wider range of stakeholders? So I don't know, Angela, I don't know if you want to talk about, what went on within PGE to kind of say, oh yeah, we should be, this isn't our bailiwick anymore, that it's a broader discussion. And then Samir, Brad, David, if you had sort of outside, perspectives of other things you're seeing either across the region or across the country.
Sure. And Phil made mention that it was hard to hear me. Is this better?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. I can't speak to what I've been with PGE for a year. I can't speak to the motivations prior to me coming here, but I could say that the leadership here really they believe that climate change is real, and they believe that their customers are central to the work, to the products that they develop and the people that they serve. And they've given me the platform and the baton to be able to carry out that. And they looked for someone who had the same, like those same types of passions. And so I think that any utility that wants to embark on this space is really going to have to believe that these things are important, and then hire people who also believe those things. Otherwise, we're not, it's not going to be, we're not going to change anything. So.
Yeah.
Go ahead, David.
This is Samir, maybe I'll.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'll
Samir, go ahead.
No worries. Yeah, no, just to underscore what Angela just said, I think, addressing decarbonization resilience, I think, is a big piece. I think I kind of see that as kind of some of the new objectives piece. So I kind of think of this in terms of new objectives, new resources, new customer expectations, and new data. So I think everything Angela just mentioned, I think, just underscores the fact that, we're trying to meet kind of those new objectives, including decarbonization and climate, but also environmental justice and other objectives, and new resources, just reflecting the characteristic and attributes of everything that's coming on the system and the full range of resources that Brad described in his first slide. New customer expectations, and Angela, I really like what you said in terms of sort of going from planning systems to planning for people, and just recognizing, what customers want, what people want from their utilities in terms of their ability to choose their power, impact sort of their environment, sort of control that, and provide services back to the system, contribute to community resilience. I think a lot of that is sort of baked into sort of enabling choices for for people and for customers and for communities. And then new data, and Brad, you might have some thoughts on this, but I think that we're seeing new sources of data come on the system, providing sort of the ability to, for that sensing, measurement, analysis, and control at the grid edge. The common wisdom was that you can't get a blood transfusion from your fingertip, right? Because sort of the surface to volume ratio at the tip of your finger is so high that it doesn't make sense to get a lot of your sort of system services from distributed resources, right? That are sort of at that grid edge. It's sort of the capillaries of the power system. But as you have more ability for visibility, sensing, measurement, and control at that grid edge, and as the cost of that declines, as you're able to create, Brad, as you were saying, kind of that digital twin, it seems like sort of those assumptions around the economies of scale could break down and could create a tipping point and kind of a key driver for accelerating some of the change that we're seeing. I don't know, Brad, if you agree with that, or if you have any perspectives there.
Totally agree, Samir, and thanks for teeing that up, because I do see that is where the future is going, is leveraging more of these distributed resources to solve some of these big issues. And just like you said, is economy of scale works to the benefit of distributed architecture. And I kind of want to go back. I got two specific utility examples where this has played out. One is I was a planning engineer in Southern California, and just east of the Los Angeles basin was the very fast growing bedroom communities of Palmdale, Lancaster, if you're familiar with the area. But the point is, there was a lot of single family residential building going on that all had single phase air conditioners that contributed to a big part of the load. And the density of all of those air conditioners, what we found is if there was a fault on the line, it could just be a relay reclose on the upstream subtransmission line, especially during those hot days. All of those air conditioners would see that and they would stall out, and we would see these low voltage throughout this whole region, and eventually feeders would trip out because all of these air conditioners are trying to start at the same time. Transmission engineer says, oh, we need more lines, we need more capacity. But this only happens very infrequently. It's like, well, does it really make sense to put in new lines? And we found you could put a little $3 relay on each of these compressors that would sense low voltage and then trip out for a short period of time and then randomly restart over the next few minutes. Transparent to the customer, they have no idea that this is happening, and it solves a multi-million-dollar problem by leveraging lots of small devices. And then so I think after that, they were able to influence some of the standards for the air conditioning compressors to be able to include some of that stuff. Fast forward
Brad,
to today.
Brad,
Yeah.
if you can pull the mic away from your face,
Sorry.
I think we're getting some rustling there.
All right, thank you. Yeah, appreciate that. Yeah. So yeah, fast forward to today is more central power plants are going offline. We have a need for what we call in the engineering side synthetic inertia, which means we need something to be able to respond high speed to some of these disturbances that the central power plants would be able to help mitigate because of the spinning mass of the generator and turbine. If that goes away, what do we deal with? And so we are working very closely with devices that can respond to frequency dips and voltage dips automatically. Now they're set to respond because they're participating in a program. And so if they see that, they would automatically respond. You get enough of those, and then you can add to grid stability and overall performance. And again, if you do that in such a way that it's a short period of time, and it's not going to effectively impact the comfort level of the customer, as long as that could respond or restore over a random interval and get everybody back in service. But anyway, so those are two examples that I have some experience with where that actually played out as a useful and cost-effective solution to those areas.
Thank you, David. Do you have anything to add here?
No, nothing here. Although, one thing that I feel like we haven't really sort of discussed and that I think is worth mentioning is just the sort of key that AMI and smart metering infrastructure is to all of this. We've talked about a lot of different solutions and, a lot of the technologies that we're going to see, put on our distribution systems. And, I know, a lot of utilities have already, undergone the process to deploy AMI across their territories, but a lot still have not, right? And I feel like there's a pretty big gap between capabilities between those things. And so it's just a kind of a point that I don't want to get lost.
Thank you. That is important. Nancy?
Yeah, I love this conversation. I guess the question that I have is about the hydro system is currently serves as our capacity resource in the Northwest. How do we overcome the cost issue in deploying the demand side resources or the demand response and distributed resources that we want when we're kind of, when we're challenged by the existence of the hydro system. Now, granted, it is not infinitely flexible and it has more and more constraints on it as the climate impacts are being felt across the region from loss of precipitation and fish and wildlife impacts. So relying on it may not be a good choice. But in the short run, right now, when we're trying to really exercise this muscle and deploy resources, it's hard for traditional demand response to compete. Thoughts on that?
I think that's why resource planning is going to be even more critical as we start to plan for the system, to start being able to model a different variety of scenarios. So what happens if you have a year with a lot of drought? What type of resources do you need to be able to help with that fast acting capacity? I really do think, just like we think about microgrids and having more of a dispersed locational type of system, we're also going to have to think about having a variety of different resources that help us for the conditions that we have, whether it's an ice storm and we have a long-term outage or it's brownouts, whatever it might be. And so I think that it's going to be really important that we start to not just model for cost-effective demand response, cost-effective energy efficiency, but we start modeling for resiliency, we start to model for equity, we start to model for policy, whatever those perspectives or questions that we're looking at. Almost like the way that the IRP has a preferred portfolio and they look at a multitude of different scenarios. On the distribution system, I think we'll need to do something very similar and then be prepared for, whatever outcomes we think are most realistic.
Yeah, I think taking that kind of a portfolio approach makes a ton of sense. I think that aligns well with what I was describing in terms of the approach that the Silver cohort took in terms of sort of that composite supply curve. I think that makes a ton of sense. I think it's also worth looking at sort of how you define capacity and recognizing that the notion of resource adequacy might also need to evolve, both so that sort of the value of all resources are thought about in sort of a apples to apple way, but also to recognize that sort of what the system needs in terms of resource adequacy, in terms of the availability of resources to provide services around sort of different characteristic timescales might evolve over time. And so that, we're used to thinking about sort of year-round dispatchable capacity. Well, maybe that needs to evolve into sort of seasonal differentiation or diurnal differentiation, thinking about, flexibility needs sort of separate from capacity needs. And there's different ways we can both think about how do you sort of present the value of resources. And Angela, you also had a good point earlier on the tariff design, that if you're thinking about demand response in the context of the tariff that was designed around sort of emergency load shed, maybe it's not designed with all the characteristics you need to address, the full range of services, the system needs in the future. So thinking about the evolution of sort of how you define value, how you compare value, and then how you create sort of the tariff and market mechanisms to sort of facilitate that, I think is going to be really key, because it's true that hydro resources today have attributes that are desirable sort of in the sort of traditional loss of load expectation kind of 1 in 10 characteristics, but that could evolve quickly, especially as we think about aggregations of DERs in a much more expansive, much more holistic way. And as we think about sort of what we need from the system in terms of not just resource adequacy in a traditional sense, but maybe an evolution of resource adequacy coupled with flexibility and resilience. And I think the answers could look very different in that context.
Yeah, I'll just add that looking at load shaping is kind of an objective here. And this becomes so important as we go forward, because our systems were designed to serve the load from central resources, and we plan for that. So basically, we forecast what the load is, and then we provide the capacity from generation and transmission distribution to meet that demand. In the future, with intermittent renewables, that's gonna shift. It's like we need to forecast what are we going to get out of the renewables, and how do we shape the load to be the most effective use of that, so we have an overall efficient system. So I can tell you there are examples with our customers in Ireland right now where they have a lot of small wind connected into their distribution network, where we have to curtail the wind from time to time because there's too much reverse power flow, not enough load on the network. It's like, well, wouldn't it be great if we could call upon demand response, like the electric hot water heaters, to start heating, preheating or pre-cooling your home if you got an EV to charge during these times, instead of curtailing it, because you curtail renewable resources, that energy's gone forever. You're not going to get that again. So a more efficient system would be demand response to actually use that what otherwise is going to be curtailed. So think of it as a more comprehensive load shaping function as opposed to just reducing demand.
I'd like to add as well. I mean, I think Nancy's question was great around just the cost comparisons, right, and how important that piece is. And I think, one example of a way to maybe help with that is using hourly marginal avoided costs and locational marginal pricing to sort of more accurately and ideally more favorably reflect the value of DERs to the system, right, and hopefully then accelerate their deployment. Because I think California is a good example where, they have an avoided cost calculator for, their DSM programs, where they actually include hourly marginal avoided costs, and similarly with marginal emissions as well. And I know that PGM has recently started sharing marginal emissions data in the 5-minute intervals for their system. And I think those are the kinds of things that can help really quantify the sort of time value of these energy services that DERs can deliver.
Great, thank you. Angela, you came off mute. Did you have something else to add?
No,
Okay.
I'll mute myself. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I just want to make sure that if you had something to say, you had a chance to say it. Brian, you had a question?
Yes, building on David's suggestion here of using locational marginal pricing. So first, I like the approach. Second, I've heard a lot of people say that they don't believe the LMPs are anywhere near correct right now. But there's a bigger gap in the utility planning process here. I have not heard any utility even think about coming up with a locational marginal value of conservation. So for example, you are at the end of some distribution line. The value of doing conservation there may be to defer upgrading a transformer or a feeder. And so there may be substantially higher value to doing very specific conservation in specific neighborhoods. And I don't know of any attempts to actually capture that. Have you seen anything better?
There's a pilot that the IESO in Ontario is developing in their York region. It's a York region. They're calling it a non-wires alternative, but it's very different than what we typically think about non-wires alternatives in the US context, where we typically think about sort of defining a distribution system need and then thinking about sort of competitive solicitation to procure resources to meet that need. This is identifying, they did have sort of a transformer constraint in their York area, but using their nodal price, locational marginal price, as a price signal to dispatch DER. And they just conducted an auction for resources and thinking about sort of providing those non-wires, but in kind of through a market mechanism. And we did some work with them on the sort of transmission distribution operational coordination aspect of some of their approaches. But that, in my mind, is a little bit unique. I think there's some, Brad, you might be able to speak to some of the flexibility services in the UK context, and in Australia, they're looking sort of operational envelopes that sort of analogous but slightly different approach. But I think typically what you see in terms of sort of value of conservation is thinking about it in the procurement sense, but I think there are some interesting examples where folks are looking at it more from sort of a market approach.
That's certainly something we are seeing more interest in, being able to model locational marginal pricing down to a feeder level, particularly as we start talking about FERC Order 2222 that allows market-based operations. And of course, ISO type markets are very familiar with locational marginal pricing. And so the only way they're going to get there with DER is if the distribution model can support that, as well as the constraint management functions. So yes, that is something that we see the need to continue to evolve and support that. And to be able to give customers more flexibility to support, to participate in those types of offerings. And I really did appreciate the example where of the question earlier of at the end of the line is where the capacity is needed. And can we provide some incentives for deployment or participation to put in the solar and battery combination to help support that end of line. I know when I was at PacifiCorp, we did do a project, non-wires alternative, to put energy storage in a remote community as opposed to rebuilding a line that would serve that, which would have been pretty costly. And what was interesting with that is we got feedback from that community almost immediately when it was energized on how much cleaner the power is. They used to see voltage dips every time a pump would go on in the neighborhoods. They'd see this voltage dip, but because the power electronics basically maintain flat voltage, it's like everybody raved about this new energy storage device, community energy storage. And so that's kind of an added benefit of looking at it from a planning perspective for the non-wires alternative, but also to get customers participate in that. And in that particular case, we negotiated with a property owner to put it in a new barn facility that he had, and that way they benefited from that as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for that.
Yeah, that's a great example, Brad, and it brings, I think, in sharp contrast, kind of that issue. I think there's a lot of focus on our LMPs, kind of the right price signal, is there economic efficiency, and do you have the right price formation? But what are you pricing? If you're pricing energy, that's really just a function of the short run marginal cost of the traditional resources. If really what you're providing, in your example, power quality, maybe some distribution capacity, that's very different, right? So I think there's a real key question of sort of what you're providing, and whether it's resilience or whether it's sort of some marginal abatement. Thinking about, I think, what you want to price and what you want to value is as important as sort of what's the mechanism to price that. So when you think about sort of what's the value of conservation, what's the value of DERs, I think thinking about sort of what's the key service you're providing is probably the first piece of that, and then sort of some of the answers and solutions sort of come behind that.
I'll kind of pop in here with a question, especially in this last discussion, we were talking about, different approaches to do different things. Is there a consistent approach, or are there consistent approaches, or are there different approaches that are being used to bring distribution system planning kind of to the fore, either in this region or in other places where you're working, and what are the pros and cons you're seeing of some of those approaches? Angela, you could maybe talk about, how PGE chose its current pathways. Samir, Brad, David, you can kind of talk about what you're seeing in other places.
Yeah, so when we developed our distribution system plan, we did look at the plans that not just here in the US, but even, worldwide, like Australia's plan and things like that, and compared, we looked at Excels, we looked at Hawaii, we went and looked at all of those and saw, okay, some common themes. Most talked about hosting capacity, most saw a need to accelerate DERs and the integration of those onto the system. And so we actually took a quite different approach in developing our DSP. So we started with thinking, okay, how does the system look today? And we were looking through a bunch of images, and we said, wow, if you look at every image of the utility, you have coal power plants, or you have some sort of generation, and then it goes like very linear to where the power is delivered to the customer at the end of the line. And then we saw some in some of the DSPs where some of the utilities were starting to show two-way flow, where they would show the home kind of feeding back into the power grid. And we thought, actually, let's just look at images of our communities that we're serving. Let's look at what does our rural community look like? And actually, we went to the Chamber of Commerce and like images of those neighborhoods and looked at them and said, okay, these are the people that are serving. And we looked at the demographics in those areas, and we picked 5 different areas with our service territory and said, okay, if we were serving these unique customers, what would that look like? And for us, that started with, okay, we'll put them at the center, and then think about all the investments that you need to make to get to those customers. And that's where we came up with our vision of having a 21st century community-centered distribution system. And then around that, we said, okay, if we want to achieve that, what are the goals that we need to have? Well, we need to advance environmental and social justice initiatives in our planning approach. We need to accelerate DER adoption, and we need to modernize the grid. And so those became the goals. And I will just be quite honest, we have a part 2 of our DSP, which is due in August of next year. And just like in part 1, we're starting with the goals and what strategies we need to get there. We don't know the how. I mean, that's just full transparency. We don't. There's going to be a lot of work between now and then on what type of investments do we need But our process has been to engage our communities and ask them for their input, tell them where we think we're really strong, and tell them where we think that we need to grow, and ask them to work hand in hand with us to develop a distribution system plan that meets their needs. You know, it really is a human-centered planning process. And so that has been our approach. And now part two is where the rubber meets the road, and we gotta figure out how we do advance environmental justice goals. How do we do non-wire solutions? How do we, you know, for modernizing the grid, we actually have quite a few initiatives. Like we have a VPP, we have our integrated, our IRC. We have a lot of efforts there, DERMS, that we're doing, but I think we have a lot of maturity to grow in like how we're actually planning for a system that's made for humans. So I would say that that's been the biggest difference between our DSP and other DSPs around the US and the world. But I'll let the other experts tell me that I'm wrong, because I'm biased, clearly.
Samir, Brad, David? Brad, you came off mute. You have something to say?
Actually, I never went on mute. Sorry.
Okay,
But
sorry.
no, I agree with Angela. I think that's right to have a diverse portfolio that can support the needs of the systems, and we certainly are seeing more focus in organizations to bring these processes together, because it used to be utilities were very siloed between policy, planning, operations, and then the customer side. Demand response was often a customer program that the planning and operations didn't have much to do with. And I think these programs have really escalated the need to bring all of these processes together. And it sounds like Angela is doing that for Portland General, which is fabulous. Yeah.
You know, I think about in my work today, one of my first jobs, I worked for the state of Ohio in the Office of Energy. And my job was to manage all the US Department of Energy grants for commercial, industrial, and task force for energy conservation and renewable energy. And we had a grant program that helped people pay for Energy Star appliances. And I was the manager of that. And I had a customer who called and complained because they didn't get their rebate. It had taken they had submitted it like 20 weeks ago. I mean, it was some unreasonable amount of time. They hadn't got their rebate. And I went and looked at the process, and we had a person who took the mail and they put it in a bin, and then a person who took it out of the bin and they took it to their desk and they put it into a database, and then they put it back in a bin, and then a person who came and took it out of that bin and then checked it to make sure it had all the paperwork, and they put it back in a bin. And then another person who took it, who then reviewed it for payment, and then they put it back in a bin. And then another person who took it up to the payment center, where then who knows where it went. And and these people all sat next to each other in cubes. There was no reason for them to walk 30 feet away to put things in a bin and not communicate and talk to each other. And so when I look at my work, I just think, like, we should understand the whole process. To your point, Brad, we can't just think about the one thing we do. We have to think about the entire process if we're going to improve it.
Samir, you had something?
Angela, I just wanted to say that, you know, I think the vision that you portrayed and kind of that humility and honesty is really inspiring. And I think, you know, it's really interesting to see kind of the industry as a whole sort of evolving, you know, from these largely radial distribution systems that are, you know, largely built to meet reliability, and now sort of transitioning to a recognition that there's sort of human needs that we're meeting, there's societal needs that we're meeting, there are big open questions that we're grappling with, like, you know, what part of the climate solution sort of resides on the distribution system, and then some really new types of regulatory discussions that are going to need to happen around, how do you think about sort of building the system that enables some of those objectives? It's exciting to see, the industry moving in the direction it is. It's interesting to see folks sort of grappling with these questions, and it's been a really great discussion, an inspiring one, and one that re-engaged me in the topic. So thanks, really appreciate it.
So, Kat, Nancy, we're getting up on time. I have one question here I could answer if we had a lightning round approach, or if you want to just steer us out. It's up to you.
I think we've had it. This is a great end to the conversation. Angela's remarks and Samir's acknowledgement of that was kind of the perfect conclusion. And
I agree. So I just wanted to make sure.
The input, I have been just super thankful in listening to this. Brad, Samir, Angela, thank you for sharing your insights, your examples, the challenges. It really has been inspiring for me. So I thank you, Jeff. You can close it up.
Okay. Well, again, we've had Angela Long, Samir Sakar, Brad Williams, David Siddiqui talking to us about distribution system planning and getting the most out of the customer side resources within that. And it's we're really kind of in a brave new world here and carving out, new territory, new trail, and it's all really exciting. And thank you very much for providing your expertise and having kind of an open and honest conversation. Thank you, participants, for your question and involvement. This this discussion will be posted on the Northwest Energy Coalition website for later viewing or sharing. If you think you have a colleague or friend that wasn't able to come but would be interested, it will be available. And with that, I thank you very much for making the moderation a very easy job. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Kat for any final words.
Thanks, Jeff, and thank you, everyone. I put the link to the pamphlet in the chat with the survey. And at this point, I think we can wrap up. So thank you so much.
Thank you.